If I could have your attention, I think we are going to get underway here. I want to begin by thanking everybody. This is a great crowd, a great turnout. We're very excited to have you here today. I'm Justin King. I work in the asset building program here at the New America Foundation. As many of you know, our work is focused on breaking down barriers to savings and asset development for low-income families and moderate-income families all across America. We believe that improved opportunity to save and develop wealth is important not just for its own sake, but because it leads to a host of human welfare improvements. There are many ways that we can achieve those improvements. We can make tweaks to the existing tax form and system. We can streamline our public assistance programs so that they not only encourage but actually allow savings, which is something that is not present in many of those programs today. As a matter of fact, a number of states have embarked on some important experiments along those lines in recent years, and we're hopeful that on this score, the federal government will follow the lead of those states. I mention that because we often forget here in Washington that there's really a two-way street, and it's probably more than a two-way street, but there's a two-way street when it comes to tax and assistance policies. We're very focused here on the federal portion, but equally important is the role of the states in setting and delivering tax and assistance policies. And it's very important to understand the way that those policies interact and play off of each other. So in order to understand the impact of any one policy, we really need to look at both the federal and state portions of that program. We have with us today two authors of a new book. Katherine Newman and Rourke are here with their book, Taxing the Poor, Doing Damage to the Truly Disadvantaged. The book takes a hard look at an area of policy that doesn't receive much attention, state tax structures and their impacts on low-income families. Taxing the Poor makes the argument that regressive state tax structures, and the most powerful examples are found in the Deep South, have significant negative impacts on basic measures of well-being: mortality, teen pregnancy, crime, school dropout rates, obesity. We're really delighted to have them here today to discuss the book. I think it's really a provocative look at sort of economic and human history as it relates to poverty in the United States today. But there's also a really interesting historical angle stretching back to the Civil War and sort of the roots of America's founding. And it raises real questions about the nature of federalism and really the nature of fairness. The book makes you ask, what is fairness? And does current policy meet anyone's definition of fairness? So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Katherine Newman is the Dean of the Johns Hopkins University Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. She's an expert on poverty and the lives of the working poor, the author of 10 books, and a former professor at Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and the University of California at Berkeley. Her co-author, Rourke O'Brien, is a doctoral candidate in sociology and social policy at Princeton University, a fellow at the New America Foundation, and a good friend both personally and professionally. He is interested in taxation, household finance, and the impact of public assistance programs on economic behavior in his research. We're also going to have two commenters today on the presentation. Michael Lind is the policy director of New America's Economic Growth Program. He's a co-founder of the New America Foundation. Michael's biography is really tailor-made to this event, as his interests lie in American history and political economy. He's the author of numerous books, including Made in Texas, George W. Bush and the Southern Takeover of American Politics, which I think has some direct implications on today's discussions. And Ezra Klein is here as well. He writes an opinionated blog on economic policy, collapsing banks, cap and trade, healthcare reform, and, I quote, pretty much anything else you can attach a chart to. His Wonk book feature has become a must-read in Washington, and if you haven't seen him on TV recently or in the New York Times, you haven't been paying enough attention. Without further ado, Katherine and Rourke are going to present for us.
Well, thanks very much. I want to thank all of our colleagues here at New America, which keeps these issues before the public and is an inspiration for all of us who are behind the ivy walls. This project has a personal origin in a sense. I was invited to go to Alabama in 2007 to help campaign for the repeal of a food tax that is exacted on all households in Alabama, 10 to 12% on food for home consumption. The campaign failed, I'm sorry to say, but it sparked in me a desire to understand what in the world would have inspired any state to tax food for home consumption in a way that encouraged such unfortunate problems as obesity as people shift to more inexpensive forms of food. When I got home, I started looking at the history of how other states began to use regressive taxation as the main mechanism for supporting public sector expenditures, and discovered that this is not a random sample of states where this happens. If you look at the states in dark green here, you will see a strong family resemblance in the southern states, which all make use of food tax as a major mechanism for driving public sector expenditures. And I became very interested in how in the world that came to be and what its consequences are for the kinds of things we in the sociological world worry about when we talk about poverty outcomes. So we are going to tell you a historical story and a contemporary story about the impact of regressive taxation on the poor. But just in case anybody thinks this is nothing more than a sort of usual academic preoccupation, I want to point out that a lot of the mechanisms that actually have been progressive antidotes to the problem we're going to discuss today are on the chopping block. So in Michigan, Governor Rick Snyder has proposed eliminating the state earned income tax credit, which we're going to argue has been really essential to making Michigan different from Mississippi. Kansas lawmakers have proposed cutting the state's earned income tax credit by almost 75%. Lawmakers in Utah are working to restore the state sales tax on food. Georgia is considering a sales tax increase on many goods, including groceries. 13 cities in the state of California have already adopted increases in the sales tax rate slated to go into effect on April 1st. And cities in California are not unique. Sales tax increases are being debated in localities across the country, from Arizona to Nebraska to North Carolina. The research community interested in poverty has not focused much attention on taxation outside of the EITC, and we're going to argue that these suites of regressive taxes should be on that radar screen if we really want to understand what's driving poverty. So let me give you just a brief roadmap to what we're going to try and do today. It's almost impossible. This lecture actually takes an hour, and we're going to try and do this in 30 minutes, so we're going to skip over some things that are important to us, and if you're interested, you can look at the book. We're going to start by looking at regional differences in income poverty and poverty-related outcomes, just to try and make the case that actually the South looks significantly different, and the West is starting to look more like the South for some of the same reasons. We're going to look at the historical patterns of property tax, the emergence of supermajority rules, which go back way, way longer than we realized. So those of you in the audience who are my age and younger know about Proposition 13 in California. We're going to try and show you that that history is more than 100 years old in other parts of the country and has had an exacerbating effect on increasing regressive taxes, having put caps on everything else. We're going to look at the growth or the origins and growth of the sales tax in the South, patterns of revenue and spending, the total tax liabilities for the poor over the last 25 years to show you this is not just a historical example, but something very much with us. We're going to look at then the big differences between the federal government, even through long periods of Republican rule in which federal tax policy lightened the burden on the working poor through the federal EITC, but the states and regions diverged very sharply in their treatment of the poor. And then we're going to try and show you that this matters for all those outcomes that were mentioned in the introduction. So let me begin just by giving you a basic outline here of some of the differences between the South and other parts of the country. These maps are going to start to look really boring because they're going to start to look almost exactly the same. The negative outcomes are going to be regionally concentrated, not exclusively so, but largely so. So if we look at median household income, the first thing we notice is the South is poor. It's a much poorer region of the country. It has been for a long period of time. So median household income is much lower in the South. And you will not be surprised then to learn that children in extreme poverty, that is children in households that are below 50% of the federal poverty line, are also heavily concentrated below the Mason-Dixon line. So in 2008, this would be $8,800 a year for a family of three. And by the way, if we had time, we'd show you how those families are taxed in the South. They're rebated in the northern states and to some degree in the Midwestern states. But even at the poverty line, those families are subject to tax. So some of the outcomes that we want to argue are related to these tax policies are those that are basic health outcomes. So life expectancy looks awful in the southern states. Mortality looks terrible in the southern states. Infant mortality. Now, when we get to these slides, I want you to notice that this is not just a pattern. In fact, it's not explained by the racial distribution of the population. There are lots of scholars who would argue that the patterns of Southern disadvantage have to do with the overrepresentation of African Americans who disproportionately suffer from these problems. So we took a look at non-Hispanic whites to try and understand whether or not they looked any different, and what we discovered was actually they don't. There's a Southern problem for whites as well. So in infant mortality, the rates for infant mortality are much higher among whites. There's a stroke belt wrapping itself around the southern states. Again, not exclusively so, but overrepresented for non-Hispanic whites in annual stroke rates, deaths from heart disease. If we look at the percentage of teenagers, 16 to 19, now we're getting out of the health outcomes and toward other outcomes that are labor market oriented, like dropping out of school. So this is a slide that looks at school dropouts, and we see, again, a very disproportionate impact of school dropouts in the South. This is a slide that looks at something we might call idleness. So these are people 18 to 24 who are not in school, who are not working, and don't have a degree beyond high school in 2008. And again, while it's by no means uniformly a Southern problem, it seems to be more pronounced in the South. Teen birth rates very closely connected to poverty rates, and again, we see a really strong Southern effect. The deep Southern states don't have a lock on these bad outcomes. The Southwestern states also have serious problems with teenage pregnancy, but from Texas eastward, we see a cluster of states with very high levels of teenage births. What about things like crime? Well, this is a map of property crime per 100,000, and property crime rates are also higher in the southern region. And then you won't be surprised to learn that the prison population is vastly higher in the South, and that is not just because of crime rates, of course. It's also because of prison or incarceration policy, which tends to lock people up faster and for more trivial offenses in the South than elsewhere. But in any case, we've got a much higher prison population. All right, so what has taxation got to do with all of this? And in order to illustrate that story, I'm going to back up into our history and look at how the tax system evolved in regional ways that were different in one part of the country from another. And the starting point here is the work done by the economic historian Robin Einhorn, whose incredible book, American Taxation, American Slavery, first began to look at the origins of taxation systems and how they varied. What she shows is that Southern tax policy privileged property owners with very low taxes on property, including slaves, and that this stunted the development of the public sector in the South. Going into the Civil War then, the South had an underdeveloped state taxation system relative to the northern states. And our own analysis of property tax revenue bears this out. So here we see that in 1860, the southern states, which are the ones with the wavy bars on the left, at the beginning of the Civil War, had the lowest property tax revenue per capita, with the exception of Louisiana, which was able to generate revenue from trade and commerce in New Orleans. The southern states are entirely at the bottom of the property tax barrel. When we get up to as you know, the South lost the Civil War, in part because they didn't have a mature system of taxation, so they didn't have adequate revenue to support the war effort. But after the war was over, after the South was defeated, of course, we get a new regime in place. Eventually, blacks reclaimed political power through radical Reconstruction. And they quickly set about reforming the tax system to generate revenue to support a more robust public sector that, for the first time, was going to include African Americans, for example, in the public schools. They had been excluded from the public schools. In order to raise revenue to make this possible, the Reconstruction governments begin to increase tax revenue. All the other states are increasing as well, but the most stark growth is in the southern states. So here we see a glimpse of that progress, if that's what we want to call this. In 1870, some of the southern states are starting to catch up with the rest of the country. So, for example, Arkansas, which increased its property tax revenue by 400% over the 1860 figure in nominal dollars, begins to start to approximate the kind of public sector revenue growth that the more northern states had. But this didn't last very long. And as other scholars have pointed out, if Reconstruction had lasted much longer than it did, we'd have a different kind of country than the one we have, especially in the South. Radical Reconstruction ends in the 1870s, and in the period that followed later, which has a title I'd actually never heard, the Redemption Era. In the Redemption Era, the federal government pulls out, whites regain control in the South, and during this redemption period, the white governments enact a series of laws to disenfranchise and discriminate against blacks that eventually came to be known as the Jim Crow laws. But the part of the Jim Crow system that we didn't know anything about, and you probably don't either, had to do with developing procedural obstacles that ensured it would be hard to increase taxes if blacks ever did regain political power. This is the birth of the supermajorities and procedural hurdles to taxation that we've come to associate with Proposition 13, but actually began in the 1870s. So let me just run you through briefly what those provisions were about and how they spread. So in the Redemption Era, we have the beginning in Alabama of a constitutional limit on property tax and education spending, and the insistence on a statewide referendum required to approve any state or local tax increase, which is why the food tax repeal I worked on failed, twice because it had to go to a statewide referendum to get anywhere, and it didn't get anywhere. So this begins in the 1870s in Alabama and in Louisiana, the two hardest core states, if you will, that invoked supermajority rules. In the Great Depression era, we start to see this spread to Arkansas, which creates a supermajority rule required to raise any tax except alcohol and sales tax. So basically, we see the provision of state constitutional requirements that make it very difficult to raise anything else other than the regressive taxes. As black power is growing and the threat, if you will, of the civil rights era arrives, it starts to spread throughout the rest of the southern states. So Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida add supermajority rules in the 1970s. And then this whole tradition, if you will, starts to spread, especially to the western states. That's Proposition 13 in action. So this is one of the reasons why these charts look the same. This is now 2006, so we're fast forwarding quite a long number of decades. The spread of supermajority rules limits property taxes and to some degree income taxes, so that even when progressive governors take office in the South, like Clinton, for example, they cannot turn to more progressive forms of taxation to address problems like revenue-starved schools. So when Clinton came into Arkansas as governor, he wanted to do something about the Arkansas schools. He attempted to do this through property tax and through corporate taxes. It was a disastrous failure. He lost an election over it because the supermajority rules raised such a high hurdle to any kind of tax reform. So even a progressive governor ends up stuck with a system that makes it very difficult to raise anything else. So if you need revenue to address the schools problem, what do? You raise sales taxes. That's what Clinton did, and it's what many of the other governors did too, and it's what they're doing in spades now. Okay, so is this just a historical story? Well, no. Now I want to shift attention to the present and take a look at how spending and revenue raising in the states and the localities has changed in ways that show the tracks of the past, the tracks of those supermajority rules. So first let's start with state and local expenditures per capita. This is now a roughly 25-year period from 1982 to 2006. And what it shows us is that over the last quarter of century, government spending at the state and local level has nearly doubled across the board. And that's after adjusting for inflation, by the way. Much of this growth has come in increased social expenditures on education, on public welfare, on health and hospitals. Federal funding on these programs has increased too, but a lot of this new federal funding, for example, Medicaid, comes with heavy matching requirements at the state and local levels. Well, where is that revenue going to come from? Especially where is it going to come from in poor states like the southern states to pay for that increased revenue? Well, let's look at some things that are not going to be sources. In the South, for example, it would appear that very little of that increased revenue raising is going to come from individual income tax revenue. Although the rate has increased over this 25-year period, the level was the lowest in the South to begin with, and it stayed that way. That's southern. You can see the South and the Midwest, South and the West at the very bottom of this chart. What about corporate income tax? We've been hearing a lot about that on the airwaves today and yesterday. Both the South and the West have refrained from making corporate income tax revenue the answer to state spending requirements. So, property tax also doesn't seem to be a particularly popular source. Whoops, sorry, I skipped a slide. Property tax revenue isn't particularly important either. So what's left? What's left to generate the revenue needed to support those federal matching requirements? Well, now we see a very different story. Now we see both the South and the Midwest arcing up to the top where they're making use of sales tax revenue, the most regressive revenue source possible. The regressive solution appears to be the solution of choice for increasing revenue, with the West and the South leading the way. In both of these regions, the presence of supermajority rules that make it very hard to raise any other kind of tax is at work in promoting sales tax. But the popularity of regressive taxation is growing and is pretty widespread. It's this graph, though, that shows us how the composition of the tax structure really varies from one region to the next. As you can see, the Northeast, the most sort of liberal part of the country, if you will, relies primarily on property and income taxes to generate most of their state revenue. So sales taxes in orange, property taxes in green. Sales tax is very low in the Northeast. Property tax and income tax are the major sources of state and local revenue in the Northeast. But the South, by contrast, the next lot over, relies much more heavily on sales taxes, with revenue from the general sales tax comprising nearly a third of all state and local revenues. And the West is starting to catch up. The West is starting to look more and more like the South since the Proposition 13 debacle. Okay, now we're going to shift to the question of how this affects the poor and why the health outcomes and other outcomes we think are linked. I'm going to turn it over to Rourke.
So far, Catherine's been concentrating on where the revenue is coming from, so the different sources of tax revenue for the states and localities that we're interested in. But that doesn't really tell us anything about the distribution of the tax burden, so who's actually paying the bill. So our goal and the reason we kind of set out to understand this book is to try to understand how the taxes the poor pay vary across the states and the cities of the South and the rest of the country. So to do that, we had to come up with a hypothetical family that we could then replicate over and over in all these different states to try to get a sense for how a family is treated by each of these different tax codes. So to do that, we created this family that we in the book called the Jones family. That's comprised of 3 people, 1 working age adult and 2 dependent children under 18. And just for reasons for the tax code, we made them renters, so not homeowners. We decided that they were going to be earning the federal poverty line. And so we kind of were able to follow that back in time, and that's adjusted for inflation. And we set them, this family of 3, at the poverty line, which is the same across all the states. So the first question was, how do we estimate their state income tax liability? Well, there's a few different places we could do that. NBER actually maintains this wonderful database that is built based on tax return data over the last 30 years that actually gives us a pretty good estimate of what these families might be paying in state income taxes in each of the 50 states. We weren't too kind of comfortable. We wanted to make sure that all of the important ways that states make their systems more progressive, like earned income tax credits and child care tax credits, were all included. So we went ahead and double-checked using TurboTax. So I went through and actually filed taxes in each one of the 50 states for this hypothetical family. And I've become really good at TurboTax, so I'm happy to help if anyone is running up to the April 15th deadline. And we found out that the numbers matched pretty spot on. So we were pretty comfortable with NBER's tax sim data. The question of state and local sales tax, though, became much more complicated. So to do this, we actually went through this survey of consumer expenditure and built together a kind of a profile of what a family at this income level might be spending on a typical basket of goods. So how much are they spending on groceries? How much are they spending on food? How much are they spending on rent? Then we took those numbers and multiplied them by the state and local specific sales tax rates for those goods. So sales tax are pretty complicated. We know about kind of the general rates that exist, but in some states, especially in the South, different types of goods are taxed at different levels. So food is taxed at different rates in different states. Clothing is taxed at different rates in different states. And in the Northeast, things like food and clothes tend to be exempt. But in the South, they're both taxed, as are even kind of medications that people rely on every month. So we went through with some colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, and we have this kind of huge spreadsheet using state tax handbooks going back in time all the way back to 1982, trying to get a handle on how these state and local sales tax rates have changed. So going forward, we kind of just have an easy way that we've been thinking about the total tax liability for these families is just kind of the income tax plus the sales tax. We adjusted all of our numbers for inflation, and we were only able to do this for 49 out of the 50 states. Alaska actually has kind of a pretty complicated tax structure that made this impossible to do for them, but we're pretty happy with getting 49. So we'll start with the federal story. So this is what the Jones family, how their federal income tax liability has changed over the last 25 years. And what you see is a really dramatic decline. And what this is the earned income tax credit. So you have it coming in Nixon kind of introduced the first iteration of it, and it was expanded under Reagan, and then again dramatically under Clinton. And you see that during this time that the family at the poverty line went from paying a sizable portion of their take-home earnings in federal income tax to actually receiving a rebate of nearly $2,000 in 2010. But when we look at the state and local level, the story is much different. So here we have the state and local sales tax liability for our family of 3, for the Jones family, in the Northeast over this period. And what you see is pretty flat. We see that the amount of money that these families are paying in state and local sales taxes hasn't really changed too much in the Northeast. But compare this graph with the South. And here you see a pretty dramatic increase. Over this time, families at the poverty line are paying an ever-increasing proportion of their income to sales taxes in the South. Next, we'll turn to the income tax liability. So this is, again, looking at the Joseph family, what their income tax liability would be over time in the northeastern states. And here you see that it's generally flat during the 1980s, and then you see a pretty dramatic and pretty steep decline in many of the states throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. And this is those state earned income tax credits. These are the state child care tax credits, all the ways that the states were trying to emulate the feds in using the tax code as a way to actually fight poverty and put money back into the hands of working families. You see by 2008, last year, we have data, pretty much no family at the poverty line who lived in the Northeast was paying any state income tax. Compare this with the South. And here again, the most notable thing is some states are increasing during this period, so the Jones family would be paying more into state coffers in the form of income tax. What's most dramatic is you see that no one dips below zero. No poor family in the South at any point in this period is actually receiving a rebate from the state government for their sales tax, for their income taxes. And this doesn't mean that these states don't have earned income tax credits. Many of them kind of jumped on the bandwagon and put in EITCs themselves. But the states that did were already taxing at such a high rate that it actually didn't generate a refund. And many of them it's almost nominal. It tends to be set at 3, 5, or 8% of the federal EITC. So it doesn't actually do much to change the burden. So what we see here is just kind of averaged across the regions over this time period. And you see this big regional divergence in the last 30 years, with the South increasing their taxes on the poor and the Northeast dramatically decreasing the tax burden on the poor. So this brings us back to our primary question and kind of the whole motivation of this book for how does this matter? How does this tremendous state and local variation in tax liability and the way the poor are treated matter for the poverty-related outcomes we care about? So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. There's a lot of math and numbers behind it. Happy to go into it more detail in the questions. Before I get there. So our strategy is to kind of look at change over time. What this is going to allow us to do is try to isolate, do the states that we see increasing the taxes on the poor, are these the same states that we see increasing negative outcomes? So one way to look at this, and this is just a simple kind of change graph. So what we have in the top right here are states that saw the largest increase in mortality and states that have the highest increase in their taxes during this period. So the y-axis here is the change in taxes on the poor. So the higher you go, the more you increase your taxes on people at the poverty line. And on the bottom here, we have kind of the outcome we're interested in the first instance, which is mortality. So one good thing is that in no place did mortality actually increase during this 25-year period, which is great. But what we see here is that the states that saw the least amount of improvement were the states that taxed the poor. So we're not controlling for anything here. We're just trying to get a sense of descriptives. Are things moving in the direction that we're interested in? So this is mortality. You compare this with property crime. Again, during this period, some states actually did see an increase in property crime, and it tended to be those states that taxed the poor. So you see kind of a positive relationship there. And finally, we see a kind of a similar relationship, not quite as clear, for violent crime and taxes on the poor. So that was just kind of a descriptive analysis. We then used some much more complicated statistical regression models. These are kind of state near fixed effects models. Our goal here is just to rule out any kind of alternative explanations that people could give. The South is just different. The political structures are different. For all of these reasons, it has nothing to do with the taxes. For historical legacy reasons and for kind of the political climate, the South is just a different place. And what we try to do is counter all those explanations and actually say, no, the taxes are a big part of this story. So we're controlling for change over time in things like the racial composition of each state, the percent black, the percent Hispanic. We're trying to control for changes in the macroeconomic conditions. So you could argue, no, things look worse because, the South didn't enjoy kind of as robust growth as other parts of the country, or you can have many different hypotheses. So we're controlling for the poverty rate, we're controlling for the state GDP. We're also controlling for a measure of state government spending. So maybe you're saying, well, those states are just, mean to poor people generally. They're not spending on schools, they're not spending on health, they're not spending on welfare. We're going to control for changes in that. We're also controlling for inequality, which sociologists have kind of determined is actually a pretty important predictor of these kind of things, and the amount of federal government expenditure. So how much are the feds actually pouring in? You could think that if the feds weren't giving a lot of money to a state, that might be one explanation for why they're doing worse. I just want to quickly walk through these outcomes. So our first thing we were interested was the effect of changes, taxes on the poor, and age-adjusted mortality. Mortality might seem like a bit of a strange outcome, but our friends in the public health world said that it was actually kind of the best summary measure of the overall health of a state or a locality. And so what we see here is that where the states that increased their taxes on the poor saw an increase in the age-adjusted mortality rate. And here kind of after you kind of go through all the math, you figure out that a $100 increase on the tax on the poor, so every extra $100 our Jones family had to pay in a given state, increased the age-adjusted mortality rate in that state by about 6.7 per 100,000. And that's kind of compared to the overall mortality rate of about 802 per 100,000. So that's mortality. And then when we're interested in crime, we know that economic conditions of families is very closely connected to the crime rates. And here again, we see a very strong, a very robust relationship that as the taxes on the poor increase, so do we see the property crime rates in that state. And again, this is netting out all of these other factors that could also be explaining it. The racial demographics, the poverty rate, the state spending, inequality, all these things that are traditionally other explanations for why we might be seeing this relationship we've controlled for here. We find the same association for violent crime. These coefficients are actually kind of pretty large when we consider it in context. We see again a negative relationship between increasing taxes and high school completion. The more you tax the poor, the lower the high school graduation rate is. Controlling again for all of these important determinants. Here now we're looking at the percentage of births to unmarried mothers, the percent of all births. We know that those who are born to single mothers tend to have kind of worse outcomes over the life course for many reasons. And we do find a relationship here that as you increase taxes on the poor, we see a higher percentage of births to unmarried mothers. One thing that we'd always been interested in as we kind of started this journey is the effect of sales taxes on obesity rates. So we know from the public health literature that the more expensive food is, the worse decisions people make, and that those who are kind of living at the margins tend to consume food that leads to the kind of the higher rates of obesity that we see around the country. We were interested in, so what does it mean to have higher sales taxes on food? Does that kind of marginal increase, can we kind of connect that in some mathematical way to the obesity rates that we see in the South and exploding in other parts of the country? So here we just looked at increases sales taxes on the poor and the percentage of obese adults in 3 time periods. And again, the relationship is there. If you increase the sales taxes on the poor, we see an association with increased obesity. That's kind of a summary of a lot of the different kind of associations that we were looking for. But I think kind of the more interesting conversation that we want to start to get you guys involved in is kind of where do we go from here? Why does this matter? And what do we think the next steps are? And I'll turn it back over to Katherine for that. Yes. Stay up here.
I'm going to go really fast through this. In fact, we may not get through this at all and do this through Q&A instead. So why do we care about all of this? Well, just reminding you that there's a pretty big divergence over the last 25 years. And so why does this matter for our story? What's the pathway by which the taxes are related to these outcomes, all these outcomes which we can agree are negative? When we raise regressive taxes, what are we really doing to families who live in places like this? Well, raising regressive taxes by definition takes money disproportionately out of the pockets of the most vulnerable. It leaves them with fewer dollars to pay for grandma's medication or to fund a healthy diet, both of which could impact mortality. It depresses the spending power of the poor, which could have an impact on property crime. In short, for anything that the extensive literature on poverty tells us, resources matter, regressive taxation matters as well. That's what our fixed effects models are telling us. You can try and knock this finding out through all those controls, and it just doesn't die. That's because taxes actually measure something important. There are lots of other pieces of direct evidence we can go into that speak to this point, but I'm going to skip that for now. This isn't just a social or moral problem, and it isn't just a problem in the South. The fact that the South is such a poor region, whose tax policies are pushing the poor deeper into hardship, has fiscal consequences for the whole country. National policies that trigger the flow of federal spending toward the states with poverty problems means that the flow of resources to the South from the federal coffers has had to climb. Relative to other regions of the country where it is largely flat or falling, the South has seen a very sharp uptick in federal spending per dollar of federal taxes paid in the South. But this federal rescue effort has not been enough to rescue or stem the trends in poverty-related outcomes that we've just gone through. And we're arguing that as long as the poor are losing those dollars, we're going to see those trends increase. What then are the solutions? Well, if the health and well-being of the most vulnerable families is at risk because of the way revenue is raised to support the public sector, what could we do to change the outcomes that are very, very costly? I think we probably should leave most of this for the discussion, which I'm going to call for in just a moment. But I'm going to argue, we are both going to argue, that the Great Depression and the New Deal offered a model for how we might think about this, because that was the period in which the basic safety net was born, and it was born at the federal level. The divergence we're seeing through the states could be dealt with by federalizing that safety net. Would that cure the problem? No. As the ferocious debates that have erupted over these expenditures and deficit problems here in Washington tell us, this would not dampen the political conversation, but it would remove some of the most egregious regional differences and transfer them into the light of day where they haven't been here at the federal level. And I think with that, we're just going to close and let our commentators join us. Thanks.
Deus ex machina there. We could have that come down at an opportune moment later, perhaps. Thanks, Katherine and Rourke. I think maybe I have some questions, and I know that we have an audience that has a thirst for questions, but maybe we could start with some instant reaction from Michael and Ezra. First thoughts, first reactions, and Michael, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, as a former staffer in the Texas State Legislature, I can say that you've, if anything, been too kind to the South. Everything you say is true. Our diabolical scheme is even more sinister than you suspect. What you leave out is the tax expenditure side, and particularly the tax expenditures to lure business from other parts of the country. So if you want to have a volume 2 that's as thoroughly depressing as volume 1, you could do that. Mississippi is the state of the union that had the first economic development program, and that seems kind of strange because you think economic development is sort of a progressive idea. But the whole idea was you would lure factories from the Northeast and the Midwest to Mississippi, and then other southern states copied this by a variety of methods, including a revival of slave labor in the form of the convict lease system. And when that was struck down by the courts, then you have these tax abatements. So you say, okay, if you shut down your textile company in Massachusetts and move to Mississippi or Texas or whatever, we'll waive the property taxes for 5 or 10 years or whatever. And so what that does is it creates a huge crater in the state budget, which, guess what, as our authors would point out, is then filled by raising regressive taxes. The other part of the diabolical scheme, and this is my only mild criticism of this book, which I endorse and agree with in almost its entirety, is I think liberals have a very naive view of the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit originated as part of this Southern scheme. It was always backed by very conservative Southern Democrats like Lloyd Bentsen, Russell Long, and because on a national level, it is a redistribution of income from people in the high-wage states to the low-wage states. And it's always portrayed as the most successful, anti-poverty program, which is quite true. It's this enormous transfer of money, from the taxpayers to poor people to supplement their low wages. But you cannot subsidize the wages of low-income workers without also subsidizing their employers and their customers. So that's just something to bear in mind. The South loves the EITC, the conservative South. And repeatedly, they championed it as an alternative to a higher minimum wage. And I have to say, whatever you think of the short-term economic effects of the living wage, the trade-off in unemployment with the EITC and so on, the single greatest thing that the federal government ever did for the South was passing a federal minimum wage in the 1930s. It was a huge shock that forced the South to move towards it's still very far from the rest of the country, but towards a capital-intensive away from a labor-intensive model. So I would say look at the expenditures and also think about the dark side of the EITC as a Southern strategy for getting the rest of the nation to subsidize its labor-intensive, low-wage system, even as it is stealing the factories and the high value added from the rest of the country. Now, in terms of the proposals, and we can get into this more in the discussion, I think everything they propose is dead on. Federalizing social insurance. The only reason we have these hybrid systems like unemployment insurance and Medicaid is because of neo-Confederate segregationist Southern Democrats, who demanded it in 1935, in the Social Security Act. Otherwise, it would all have been federal. If you remove the incubus or the succubus, depending on the gender, of these hybrid programs from the states, that immediately helps a lot of the state fiscal programs. And then, so I think rethinking federalism, so social insurance is done entirely at the national level. It's something that we've supported, and it's a great idea. I think we're going to have a value-added tax in the long run to pay for government the way all the other industrial countries do. We rely to a much greater extent on payroll taxes and income taxes. And in most other countries, including much more generous social democracies, they do have national consumption taxes. And this is discussed in the solutions chapter. A VAT is regressive. It can be made less regressive by exempting certain items, although then you have to have a higher rate. But here's the point. A regressive tax is less regressive if it's federal than if it's state, right? So let's say if you have a VAT in Mississippi, it's going to be much more regressive than a U.S. VAT if it's accompanied by revenue sharing on the basis of population, because then, let's face it, you'll be raising lots of money in New York and in Northern California, and it's going to be flowing into Mississippi and into New Mexico. So that's something to think about. Now, suppose you do this. Suppose that you get the states out of the social insurance business. You have revenue sharing. You've already crippled much of the Southern model right there. So what do the states then do in this new federalism? What do they rely on for revenue? You can make a case that it's dangerous for a state to rely too heavily on progressive income taxes. And we've seen this in the state of New York, for example, where they became so reliant, and New Jersey as well, on finance sector, billionaire incomes, that then when the stock market craters or even capital gains, then so you do want kind of broad-based taxes, it seems to me. And the ideal one, if the state's out of the social insurance business, is higher property taxes. And it can even be a progressive property tax. You can exempt, a certain amount. And there are two reasons for it. The first is, here the public is more likely to support it because there's a direct connection between what the states are now doing now that they're out of social insurance. It's largely infrastructure, local and regional infrastructure. And there's a direct connection between what the legislature is raising the money and then how it's spending it. But also there's the old 19th century Henry George argument that property taxes give you an incentive, if you're a government, to develop your region. right? So that if you're Northern California, a tiny property tax can raise vastly more money than if you're this broken down, rural plantation economy. So those are just some thoughts. But as I say, I think this is a tremendous project. It's putting regionalism back into a topic that is usually discussed just in terms of left and right ideology. And given the regional divisions in this country and their importance for politics, I think it's a very important project.
There's a lot there, and I expect that between the audience and our panel and within our panel, we're going to return to that. But I do want to turn to Ezra quickly and just give him an opportunity as well to overview his thoughts.
Great, thank you, and thank you to New America for inviting me. When they originally invited me, I said, I don't know that I can make it. It's a Wednesday; those are busy. But then they said, Rourke would do my taxes, so here I am. I appreciated the presentation. It was really interesting and seemed quite persuasive. I'm not, I think, completely convinced yet that we have a causal story that makes sense to me. We have a fair amount of regressions done, and I appreciated the controls. But I can't yet tell myself a story under which the taxes that we're observing have the range of effects we're talking about. It seems more likely that there are some unobservable, or at least uncontrollable factors that are generating a variety of these effects. One perhaps being related to the fact that presumably the reason these taxes are coming into effect have to do with a lowered political power among the poor in these particular states. Why that would be, I think, is an interesting question, but it seems to me that we could be seeing a sort of a common spring there, given different things we've observed with status and the relationship to health and other outcomes. So I'd be interested to see or hear more on that, because it seems to me that's quite important here. I was fascinated to see some meat put on the bones of what happens to a low tax state, because I think the answer a lot of people like to give is there are low taxes, and I think the answer you give is there are regressive taxes, and the two things are different. Haley Barbour, who people might know is mounting an improbable campaign for president, has bragged about managing to get Mississippi out of a big budget deficit without raising taxes at all. And so some people went and looked at the record and they said, well, you raised cigarette taxes a couple of times, including establishing them. You've put taxes on hospitals that didn't exist before you came. Aren't these taxes? He didn't answer them, but my working assumption is they know they're not taxes. That taxes are sort of defined in this strange way of taxes are fees that rich people notice being levied upon them, and that I think speaks to what we're seeing here, that I think the increasing definition of taxes in the conservative movement, you do see this with a lot of these states, is that if you're raising user fees, you don't get tagged as a tax hiker, but user fees by their very nature tend to be quite regressive. So being an anti-tax politician often is a question not of whether or not you're willing to charge people for things, but the distribution that you end up having once you do begin to charge them. And I think you guys do a lot there. One thing I noticed in a number of your maps was the presence of Utah, which is not part of the South and does not strike me as particularly culturally similar, but is similarly very conservative, very anti-tax, and appeared to have a lot of the same types of fees that we saw there. And then the final point, because we've talked a little bit about federalizing some of these programs, is sort of a point I like to make, and I did a lot of coverage of healthcare, and so I used to make it in terms of Ben Nelson as a genius, which towards the end of healthcare he didn't really seem to be. But the Cornhusker kickback, as it got called, wherein the federal government had to pay every dime and dollar of Nebraska's Medicaid expansion, was, contrary to popular opinion, a terrific policy idea. Its only problem was that it was confined to Nebraska. The sort of state federal share of Medicaid is just a bad idea. And we've really seen it during the financial crisis, wherein it just creates an incredible squeeze on the 49 of 50 states that cannot run deficits, with Vermont being the only exception there. If we had things like Medicaid being a full federal share, that would, in times of, particularly in times of recession, act as an enormous automatic stimulus, because a lot of essentially the anti-stimulus or the contraction we're seeing has been on the state level, and a lot of it has been because of the natural expansion of these social programs at a moment when revenues drop and also need increases, so they have to spend more and they get less. So certainly I'd like to see that, but I'd say the political outlook for it is cloudy at best. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys, and thank you again for the presentation.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's some agreement that that federalization is a promising option from a policy perspective. I'd like us to dig into the politics of that a little bit later, but before we do that, I want to give Katherine and Rourke the opportunity to defend their honor against Ezra's outrageous charges of unobservable effects being at the root.
So I think what we need to dig deeper into the point Ezra raises is some evidence that changes that affect the income streaming into a poor household actually have an effect on that household. Okay, and what we've shown are state level rates changing, which is actually really very difficult to show because those states are diluted by all the non-poor people who are also bearing these effects. So in the book, we go through all of the existing evidence that lends credence to the argument, and I think it's pretty persuasive. So for example, there was it the Great Smoky Mountains? Some accidental studies that weren't done for this reason. There was one huge study that tracked children in the Great Smoky Mountain region over a long period of time, long enough to look at the impact of changes in income in households on high school graduation rates like 20 years later. And so here's the accident that happened. An Indian casino opened up in this region, and $4,000 annually came into the households only of the Native Americans that were designated as recipients of this income. So this was an injection of significant resources into poor households where I would argue the political power didn't change at all, right? There's nothing that changed other than this injection, and 15, 20 years later, way higher rates of high school graduation and way lower rates of incarceration. There are a bunch of other experiments, if you will, in the creation of EITCs and so on that have had the effect of injecting financial resources into poor households where we could track these outcomes over time just for them. And I think it really does add a lot of causal credence to the models that we used, which I want to remind you, it's really difficult using these fixed effects models to find any effect. Most of the time, these kinds of high-powered statistics show you zero. So the fact that we were able to show fairly robust effects, like those little stars out 3 lines, those are very heavy-duty effects. And I think when combined with this evidence about direct evidence lends some credence to the causal story here. Do you want anything to
Yeah, just a small piggyback on the causal point, which is definitely one we kind of get pretty often, kind of how do you make this connection between taxes and mortality and obesity and all these points. When we keep saying fixed effects and we keep kind of putting it up on the board, that's kind of a big bells and whistles to all of the kind of academic audiences. One of the things we try to do in these models is control for the states themselves, because obviously a big difference between the states is things like cost of living or the politics, the political culture, or even the food that people like to eat might be unhealthier in the South. And you just have to kind of trust that under the hood, one of the things we're getting at with these models, they're actually able to control for the states themselves. And so by just isolating the change, we have to think of the only things that could also be throwing off kind of our estimates are things that are changing simultaneously. So as long as we kind of think that the South is kind of the poor in the South have kind of lower political power or whatever other story you might create at the outset, and we think that hasn't changed systematically over time, we will have kind of netted it out in our models. And that's as technical as I'll get without having to read the book aloud.
Actually, my ear actually started to bleed a little bit already. Maybe in the minority in the room as being totally unqualified to comment on fixed effects. But I want to sort of accept that, and I want to sort of move on with one sort of question from my. So you're saying that you've shown that there are these connections between state tax policies and really sort of severe negative social outcomes. But does the model, does your research show you how? I mean, what is the pathway through which one gets from point A to point B here?
So the basic model is that money matters. That won't shock anybody in the audience. That what a household can bring to bear on, for example, where it lives. Right? If you have less resources, you can't move out of a dilapidated neighborhood. If you have less resources, you will shift the food you eat. And we keep emphasizing obesity because so many of the negative health outcomes are driven by obesity. So we know that if you raise the price of food, and this is a way of raising the price of food, diet shifts, and then you have all these awful stroke outcomes and so on that we showed you. So the basic mechanism is that money matters, and it's through these other experimental forms that we try to show that money is actually making a difference. Anything that is resource dependent is going to be affected by raising taxation, because it's basically a way of taking money out of the pockets of poor people in particular, and a much higher proportion of money out of their pockets than would otherwise be the case in the northern states. So that's the basic answer. I'd like to come back to the point that Michael raised about VAT taxes, because there's kind of a romance developing with VAT taxes, and I think he's made a series of important conditional attachments to a VAT proposition, and that's exactly what worries us, which is that we think and you guys are the political experts here, we think the political likelihood of those conditionals being attached to a VAT tax is lower than we might want. So VAT taxes are extremely popular in Europe, and they do help fund an enormous amount of progressive spending that tends to lift poor people up the bottom and to provide them with health care and education and free college and so on and so on. I think the likelihood that VAT taxes would be used to cure the deficit right now would be huge. So I can imagine a progressive VAT. I can imagine a VAT in which either items are exempted that fall into this basic category of food and clothing and medicine. I can imagine a VAT tax that doesn't kick in until you're over $100,000 in income. I can imagine all of those things. But what worries me is what if that's not what followed? And when we look at that long list of states I started off with that have repealed their state earned income tax credits, which, whatever their origins, actually are very effective means of putting money back in the hands of poor people, especially in those states that rebate them, it really worries me about what passing VAT taxes would mean, because they are highly regressive, and I'm not sure we're in a political climate in which being more progressive about expenditure is likely to carry the day. But I'm not the political expert here.
Well, I don't know if there's any political expert on an imaginary tax. But I think there are three ways to make a VAT progressive, one of which seems less likely to me, but the other two seem quite likely. The first thing you do is you have revenue sharing. If you look where VATs have been introduced where they didn't exist before, like Canada and Australia, these are federal systems, then the states insist on it, that you have the revenue sharing. And even if it's badly designed, a badly designed national regressive tax, if it's shared with states or provinces, is at the local level is progressive, assuming you have inequality among the subunits. So we would get some kind of revenue sharing as a precondition if it came at all. The second one is exempting necessities, food and clothing and so on. The only group that is opposed to this consists of tax policy wonks who just, as a matter of principle, our colleagues at various think tanks, who are just opposed to all exemptions because it clutters up the code. Congress, of course, it would fill it up with all kinds of, now some of them they might go overboard, but I don't think there's any political danger that they're going to follow the advice, of the academic economists and say no exemptions for food, no, it has to be completely broad-based. No. So if you had it, there would be these popular exemptions. The third thing, which I think is less likely politically that you're justified in being worried about, is the idea of rebates. And a lot of academic economists, and in this case it really is kind of an academic debate because it's not what countries actually do. They say, well, ideally you would have a VAT and there would be no exemptions for food or clothing or shoe wear or anything, but there would be a rebate, right? Well, okay, that's true in the seminar, but there's no country that really does that. All of the VATs have exemptions of some sort and higher rates, so they become in effect luxury taxes. So I think the politics against having a rebate would be very powerful. So, but that's just my guess, that 2 out of the 3 you would get.
As it happens, I don't think Mike knows this about me. I happen to have a PhD in imaginary taxation. And I would like to reassure Catherine and just note that I consider the danger of us passing a VAT at any point in the near future to be roughly akin to busting the budget by quintupling our foreign aid expenditures or something. I mean, As sure as I am about anything in American politics the next 3 years, I am certain that will not happen. The capacity to pass any type of tax seems to be about nil. If you remember, Barack Obama has a standing pledge to not increase taxes on anybody making under $250,000. It's a dumb pledge. It has been broken already in sort of backdoor ways, but he cannot break it in a front door way like that. The administration would not be capable of surviving it. If you look at the current state of play in Congress, they are currently incapable of letting tax cuts for people making over $250,000 expire, and the consensus Democratic position is that the tax cuts that Bush passed for the other 98% of Americans are actually totally correct, and Clinton was some sort of high taxation maniac. So I think that the current state of the taxation debate in America is grim, and the idea that we're going to do much in terms of a large consumption tax seems very remote to me.
And on that's actually a point I was hoping we would get some people to comment on, sort of the current political status and how the status quo, as Katherine and Rourke have described it, fits into that. But I want to sort of pivot away from that for a moment, and I want to bring the audience into the discussion. And if there are questions that folks have at this point, we'd love to welcome you into that discussion. If we could see a show of hands, but please remember that we'd love to know who you are. We'd love to know where you work, if that's relevant, and we'd love you to wait for the microphone and have a question mark at the end of your remark. And I actually think it'd be great if we started all the way in the back. That'd be terrific. We can move forward from there.
Hi, my name is John W. Milton. I am a professor part-time at Central Michigan University. I've spent the last 4 years in South Africa.
Can you speak up a little bit, sir?
Oh, my name is John W. Milton. Can you hear me?
That's better. Thank you.
And I am associate professor at Central Michigan University, and I spent the last 4 or 5 years in South Africa. But on this side of the ocean, I'm a member of the Anacostia Bible Church at 16th and T in Southeast, right off of Martin Luther King Avenue. And the notion of the connection between poverty and obesity and mortality seems to be, intuitive. But to give you an example of that, 5 years ago I started this program at the church, and I bought expensive protein from GNC and other places to start an obesity. We call it. I didn't call it obesity. I called it a health training program. And interestingly enough, even after 5 years, I couldn't affect the change of behavior. And walking down the streets from the church, I saw several advertisements at the bus stops. One was a European lady sitting on the hood of a Mercedes-Benz right off of Martin Luther King Avenue, and then the other one was a European male riding a Bronco with a Marlboro in his pocket. And so I walked down the streets and we did a study of that neighborhood. We couldn't find a single black male who was obese over 60 years old. So that when you start talking about obesity and mortality, I think you can I find this study very interesting and more theoretical, but this is a practical application of the poverty level. And in fact, I asked my pastor, had he ever met an obese African-American male that was over 60? He didn't remember ever meeting one. Nobody in the church ever met one. I've never seen one. And I spend a lot of time in the South. So I wanted to congratulate you. This is maybe not a question, but I do want to ask you about the in Congress now, the notion of the European, I'll just say Republican Congress, want to decrease subsidies such as employment and health care and education, so on and so on. And how does that impact your study? Thank you.
Yeah, let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll come back to that. I actually saw in the middle here on the left-hand side, was there, or we'll come a little bit further forward. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for the good presentation. Chester Hartman from the PRAC, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. Both that previous question and your reference to the Native Americans makes me wonder, is there a racial lens through which you might analyze and prescribe around this issue. I didn't hear race raised at all. And
Katherine and Rourke, let's start there and see where it goes. Both questions have a little bit of a racial tie-in. How did you handle the question of race in your research?
So one of the reasons why we looked at things like white obesity rates in the South was to try and see whether or not we were looking at a race effect or a poverty effect. Of course, race and poverty, as you well know, Chester, are very deeply intertwined. But we took it as a piece of fairly important evidence that whites look pretty bad in the South, too, so that this is not just a racial effect. I sadly think it would be easier to dismiss this if you thought it was just a race effect, and that it was very important to show that this was a poverty regime that is exacerbated by taxation that affects everybody who lives in these regions. So we examined this angle in a sense by trying to look at how people of different groups are affected by these taxes. But I also have to say, I think the race story here, the one we tried to allude to anyway, really has to do with how the possibilities of political power, or actually the exercise of political power during radical Reconstruction, one of the few periods where it actually switched hands, created a powerful motive for white governments, especially in the South, to erect barriers to progressive taxation that are the single biggest reason why we're not likely to see much regional change, because those are embedded in state constitutions, and they have been now for nearly 100 years. In the West, the story is a little different as to the reasons, the origin of the motivations, but I'm not sure the outcome is all that different. The Western states, starting with Proposition 13, enacted the same kinds of barriers to raising progressive taxes. And one of the things we didn't get a chance to say is that when one state does so, it creates a ripple effect in the states around the region. So the reason Utah looks the way it does is that Utah and Oregon and Washington, all the western states began to, avoid losses to California by also enacting the same kinds of supermajority rules. So there's a race story in how this legislation came to the South, and there's a race effect story in the West, not because of the origins of this tax, but because of the consequences of increasing regressive taxation at exactly the time when those states are becoming racially far more diverse than they were when I was growing up in California, for example.
Can I take panelists and ask you a question based on that? Because I'm interested to hear you put political structure, so central in the story. Because I've long wondered whether or not, people talk about whether or not we're more center-right than Europe, and they say, well, we don't have health care, but, we had 6 presidents run and win on health care, and it usually got filibustered to death. So one of the arguments people make in political science is that we have a more status quo-oriented institutions in this country, and those are at the root of a lot of that. Did you do much comparative public opinion research in the states you're looking at versus others and see if there is a difference that seems to would seem to explain it aside from the structures, or it seems to be the structures?
Right, we did a little bit. We are not public opinion specialists, though. We dress rehearsed all this research with all of our colleagues in political science who are. But the most interesting stuff we looked at actually was commissioned by the Nixon administration when they were doing the first sort of dry runs at what the EITC, or the early precursors to the EITC, might look like. The most tragic finding for us was that there's very little regional variation in public attitudes toward regressive taxation. Basically, sales taxes are regarded by most Americans everywhere as fair, because we all pay the same, right? That loaf of bread, you pay it, I pay it, everybody pays it. The whole idea of progressive taxation actually doesn't have a very deep toehold in the American political imagination as revealed by opinion polls. I think the idea of fairness, this is really difficult for us for the argument we're making. If fairness means everyone pays the same, then the idea that that same is coming out of a very different income pocket for the poor versus a billionaire, it's a real uphill climb in terms of political opinion. And it doesn't vary by region, hardly at all.
And just to jump in on the kind of the structure and comparative question, I think one of the big findings from political science, in the last 2 decades, trying to understand, why is the U.S., so miserly in its treatment towards the poor, is the importance of race, and that places, societies that are racially heterogeneous, have, just much lower levels of support and much lower levels of actual funding towards redistributive ends. One of the things I've become interested in since we've been working on this project was can you say the same thing about the taxes? We have some great anecdotes in the book about, when, during the redemption era and then during the civil rights era, you see in the newspapers, everyone talks about, we want to have increased sales taxes because it's fair, because it's all, and the narrative is it's, because we want black people to have to pay for their own schools.
And they don't have any property, so.
And so we want to make sure that, they're also bit by it. So some of the work I've been doing kind of since we've completed this project is trying to look at can racial heterogeneity explain kind of the regressivity of tax systems? And it looks to work exactly the same way as spending. So the same way that racially homogeneous societies spend more on their poor, they also tax the poor a lot less. And I think that the connection there is pretty clear.
Well, you're quite right about the connection between heterogeneity and low redistribution. I would caution you about assuming that there's something about Southern political culture that makes it against a progressive income tax, because the reason we have a progressive income tax is the South, the reactionary 19th century, early 20th century South, because it was the alternative to the tariff. And since they were a commodity exporting region, they paid this tariff, which was a 40-50% tax on manufactured goods that went to Northeastern and Midwestern industrialists who were protected. And so the one thing the South and the rural Midwest and West agreed on was free trade, getting rid of the tariff. It wasn't out of belief in the abstract merits of free trade. It was a purely regional thing. In replacing the tariff as the basis of federal revenue with the federal income tax. So your data indicates that Southerners have turned against the income tax since then. But it just underlines your point that a lot of this is kind of strategic, in this competition among regions with different interests.
And also the elites in the South were very divided. The elites who were merchants looked very different than the elites who were slave owning and property owning. There are great class fissures in the South that also help to explain these outcomes.
Let's take it back out to the audience. I see Irene.
Casey Foundation. I think your maps and charts make a very strong case, obviously, for the linkage between the sort of regional differences in taxation and in poverty and outcome levels. I'm intrigued by the causal mechanism we were talking about around in terms of the impact of taxation on family budgets. The flip side, obviously, is state spending, which is linked to taxes, obviously, and so the other possible explanation is state spending on health and education and other things is lower in states with lower taxation in general. So is there any way to tease that out? I mean, it's probably a bit of both. I like the idea that income family income is a key determinant, but how can we test that? And obviously the expenditures are somewhat are being subsidized by federal inputs in some of those states, as you showed, so it makes it murky, but I'd love to hear a little bit on that topic.
Absolutely. So yeah, two clear kind of other mechanisms is the degree to which states are spending on health and welfare, and the degree to which the federal government is also kind of coming to their rescue. I kind of went through this presentation very fast, but those are kind of two really important controls, where the degree to which the state is spending on things like health and welfare, kind of the redistributed, the social spending is kind of the way we're thinking about it, as well as the amount of money coming in from the feds. We didn't show all of the numbers that would be coming out of kind of all of those regression outputs. Clearly, those are two really key determinants. So the states that tax the poor the most also tend to be the states that spend the least on those kind of redistributive ends. And so kind of for our argument that we're trying to make is that, that connection seems more clear to people, more obvious to people. You just look at, per pupil expenditures, and you can have some arguments about education outcomes. We were trying to say net of that, kind of net of the degree to which these states are also the ones that aren't providing for the poor. Can we make a case that by taxing them, it's making things even worse? But yeah, you're right at the question that we were trying to tease out all these different pieces.
And I think right here in the middle.
I'm Rebecca Wilkins from Citizens for Tax Justice, and a couple of things that folks in this room might find really helpful is our sister organization, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, does a report called Who Pays? And it looks at all the taxes that people pay, state, local, property, sales, everything, and looks across the distribution quintiles and see how do those taxes impact different people. And an example is in Georgia, someone in the lowest quintile spends about 8% of their income on sales taxes. In Georgia, the people in the top 5% pay less than 0.5% of their income on sales taxes. We also think that renters pay property taxes through the rents they pay. Another thing that we'll be doing again around tax day is something called All Americans Pay Taxes, because you will hear that 47% of people didn't pay taxes last year. They didn't pay federal income taxes, but they paid sales taxes, they paid all other kinds of taxes. A couple of questions I have for you is if you looked at two issues. One is how we tax income from work at a higher rate than we tax income from capital or investment. And another is if you looked at all about how state tax havens impact surrounding states. For example, we know in developing countries that for every dollar of aid that comes in, about $10 of resources go out through tax havens, through the corrupt government officials siphoning money out of the country. But you know, if you look at Southern California, right next to Nevada, which is a great tax haven where wealthy Californians can hide their money, how does that impact the poor in California, for example?
These are excellent points, and this book was not really designed to address most of them. That is to say, we were less interested in things like tax fairness from the haven point of view, which is very much alive in the airwaves just in the last couple of days here in Washington, than we were in trying to show what the linkage was between the way we tax the poor and all of these poverty-related outcomes. This is really a book about poverty and its relationship to state and local taxation. But all the issues you're raising are very much on the radar screen and should be of citizens and tax specialists. And I actually would like to give a special plug to your organization, which was extremely helpful to us when we first got started. We ended up having to go elsewhere to do most of the work, but had it not been for Citizens for Tax Justice, it would have been hard for us to even get started. So, but there are many, many more issues of tax justice, tax havens, and who's paying what that seem to us to be extremely compelling. I think those are issues that are much more on the radar screen of people organized around tax issues. This stuff is not on anybody's radar screen, which is why we were pursuing it.
Let's go over here.
Bob Wilson. I'm on the faculty of the OBJ School at UT Austin and here in Washington at the Wilson Center. I'd like to call attention to the local government piece of the argument. I think you're correct in focused on states, but it's really interesting to think through a bit how this would all play out in terms of local government. I'm pretty confident that the largest change in the composition of local government revenues has been through fees. The taxes have not really changed that much. And this is in part because the local government structure established by states don't allow localities to do much except raise fees. I'm pretty sure the incidence of fees will reinforce your argument. If you got to pay a fee, poor won't use it. But it'd be interesting to incorporate that also. The politics of it, if you think poverty now is high rates of poverty in cities, in big cities, this problem is even more dramatic. And we know city councils, city elected officials are concerned about this, and their hands are to a large extent constrained by state law.
You make an absolutely devastating and very important point. We raise it in the book, but actually finding data on fees at the local level, it's almost an impossible task for two scholars anyway. But you are absolutely right. Driver's license fees, bridge tolls, you name it, and parks, almost anything that generates a fee is almost by definition, it's certainly regressive. We can't call it a tax exactly, but it has the same kinds of regressive effects. And the closer those fees are tied to necessities, the more devastating it is. You're absolutely right. So we were arguing here that we are actually showing a fairly conservative estimate of what the impact of regressive policy is on the poor. Because if we could add in the fees, it would be way over what we talked about.
One thing we did try to do, though, is move beyond the states, try to understand how localities do rely on the sales taxes. In a lot of states, the sales tax has really kind of almost replaced the property tax as the main source for local revenue for schools. There are special school taxing districts that can increase the sales tax in those communities. And I think, especially now as we're seeing, as Catherine mentioned in the beginning, this seems to be the revenue generator of choice during the recession, that localities are really where they have the freedom to do so, are really jacking up those sales taxes. So all the numbers we presented to you had some sort of kind of weighted average by the state in terms of the degree to which the localities are also increasing the sales tax. tax. When you just kind of look at the nominal rates in some of the southern states, they don't look so bad. It's when you see, every locality is also able to slap on a 4 or 5% tax of their own on top of the food that you start getting into the double digits in places that, would look kind of astronomical to people from the Northeast.
In fact, Alabama being a good example, the state part of that food tax is only about 4%. For the rest, the 6% going up to 8%, which was the highest we found, is all localities. And their opportunities to replace that revenue are very, very slim. Hence, they are ferocious about holding on to it. So the politics of this at the local level are really almost impossible.
Ezra, do I see? No, good. So there's two here on the left-hand side I'd like to get up front, and then we'll move backwards.
Hello. Hi. I'm George Edwards. I'm new to Washington, and I look forward to joining the workforce here.
It ain't all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah. I remember back when the Obama administration was putting together the health care bill, they were kicking around this idea of a tax on like sugary beverages. And it was just an absolute non-starter. It was like maybe a 2-cent tax on soda nationwide to help pay for the bill. And you mentioned really that these regressive taxes are essentially draining consumer power out of the poor. And I'm curious to know if you think there could be some kind of political strategy based around the idea of marketing like small businesses and their suppliers that this is really their customer base, that they're losing business, that you could really maybe build like a local grassroots campaign effort around something like that.
Well, it's an interesting point because actually the only organized interests, corporate interests in Alabama that were supporting the tax repeal on food was the grocery industry, for exactly the reasons you point out. I should say that there are really contradictory effects here. I mean, it is true that if you look at the states that have exacted huge cigarette taxes, that you see a real decline in smoking, right? It's not that there's no other beneficial effects to taxation like that example. But if you ask who's paying that money and who's receiving the benefits from it, now you're looking at an inequality story that's very pronounced. That doesn't mean there aren't other, potentially helpful mechanisms. And another thing that has not been mentioned but goes along with the fee point is the lottery. In the southern states, it began in the southern states, the use of the lottery to fund higher education has been a very powerful instrument for providing scholarships for families in southern states. So who pays for lottery tickets, who buys lottery tickets, and who got the education benefit? The answer is the poor buy lottery tickets for the most part, and it's the more well-to-do who got those benefits in terms of higher education. Now, that actually was not a racial story. The increases in black college going in the southern states that enacted lotteries to support higher education were quite pronounced. But it is a class story because, those were more affluent or more middle-class African Americans. Now, we can say that there's a goal that we all share of diversifying higher education. As a dean, I certainly wouldn't argue with that. But if we're asking or providing instruments whereby the poor pay and everybody else benefits, there are consequences, we're trying to argue, that aren't just social justice consequences. If more people are incarcerated, if you have more low-weight babies, if you have more obesity, we are paying for all of that. We are paying for that in lives lost prematurely, in children who aren't graduating from high school, and those things cost too. That's our basic point.
I want to take two questions in a round, and then we're going to finish out strong here. I saw one over here, and then in the middle left there.
Dave Oxter. I do public health advocacy, and like to make a comment and then a quick question. The information we have. Can you confine
yourself to the question? We have a couple of people that want to ask them, and we are running short on time. I want to respect people's commitment. Then
the question is: I was at a colorectal cancer screening hearing just before I came here, and they had that map where the states that had the most legislative procedures in place for colorectal cancer were in the South. They're Texas and they are are Arkansas and they are Louisiana. And the poorest health outcomes are in those states. So there's a disconnect between legislative initiatives to do public health things and the actual health outcomes of that state. So, the question would be, would the tax system trump public health initiatives?
And let's go right behind you.
Thank you. Rob Levy with the Center for Financial Services Innovation. We're a think tank that focuses on financial services for the un- and underbanked in America. My question is just that, when we see the rise of the taxes, sales tax and income tax on low-income folks, particularly in the South, the last 25 years, it also coincides with a rise in clearly the need for credit to handle emergencies, and payday lending and predatory lending has gone up, and we all know the effects of that. And it also seemed that those states are the ones with the least consumer protections around payday lending and things of that nature. And I was wondering if you looked at any correlation between the rise of the payday lending industry as well as the lack of consumer protections in those very same states.
And I think we are. Do you want to? You're good. Let's
Okay, I'll take the first question, and Rourke will take the second one. So it's just a truism that we should bear in mind that the delivery of health care doesn't tell you very much about who gets sick. It tells you about what happens after people get sick. The predictors of illness, like cancer, have much more to do with all of the forces of inequality that govern diet and exercise and toxic exposure and tons of other things, which are not about the provision of health care. That's not to say health care is unimportant. It's extremely important. But it's really, really important once you get sick. The patterns of who gets sick and with what are not really determined by the provision of health care. The detection and how the treatment rolls out afterwards clearly is connected to the provision of health care. So the fact that you have high rates of colorectal cancer in places that have, the most aggressive sort of hospital treatments or clinical trials or something, those two things are not connected in quite the way they might appear to be. So let me turn it over to Rourke about credit.
Before we move on to the second, I'll just make a quick comment on that. There are two things you don't want to do if you're uninsured in this country. One is get sick, and the other is move to Texas. They have a 25% rate of uninsurance. Their healthcare system is, I think, very, very arguably the worst in the nation. It's an interesting fact of the Republican primary right now that Mitt Romney, whose state has, because of him, the lowest rate of uninsurance, is considered completely unacceptable due to his health care record. But Texas Governor Rick Perry, who has a 25% rate of uninsurance, is like true blue conservative, or I guess true red. But I wouldn't mistake screening programs for a functional healthcare system at all. I would guess, actually, that one reason you have such aggressive screening in that state is because the normal pathways by which you would get screened, you have insurance, you go to the doctor, are completely dysfunctional. So they have essentially ineffective substitutes.
Rourke?
Yeah, and quickly on the demand for alternative financial services and the explosion in credit and debt, I think you could tell a story that those states where families have to pay a higher proportion of their paycheck into the state coffers, at the lowest levels, the vulnerable folks, there might be increased demand for kind of these more predatory kind of credit circles. I think the more interesting question is kind of the cycle that we've gotten in on an annual basis on the role of the EITC and the tax refund as a time to pay down debt. And the difference between kind of what those refunds look like in the Northeast and the South, I think, are why you might kind of see people getting stuck in cycles of debt and poverty in the South, whereas in the Northeast, they're able to kind of pay off a larger chunk of kind of whatever credit they've amassed during this time. I think all these questions are definitely intertwined and really important.
Yeah, that tension between sort of credit and saving is something that's very, very present in low-income households. And it's actually something that we have a planned event on this summer that we're working to construct now. So I'd welcome people to stay tuned to that. I want to just sort of finish up by thanking our panelists today, Ezra and Michael, and Rourke and Katherine. I really recommend the book. One of the pieces that we didn't really get to today, there are some really compelling human stories in the book as well, and I want to compliment Rourke and Katherine for including those and recommend it to folks as they read it. Thank you all for being here today, both in person and online. It was a pleasure. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Congratulations.